My rebuttal is from the speaker's claim on drug enforcement is an unnecessary drain on our government's already strained resources, with the justification on our country's current debt of $60 trillion, and how the program is ineffective, with his secondary claims being that the drug enforcement is expensive and is ineffective. First off, the $60 trillion that he claimed that we are nationally indebted, I'm not sure where he got that number from. I looked it up. It's a very vague debate that we're under $60 trillion in debt, but we actually have a national debt clock which calculates everything that's going on every millisecond, and it's actually $17 trillion in debt. So to refute his first claim that it's expensive, I felt like he lacked evidence, talking about the vague numbers of 60 trillion to the 17 trillion, and claiming that from a New York Times report. But the DEA actually has a budget, so it's not necessarily just going into a debt. Just like how the education, the payroll, and the fire department, or law enforcement has an actual budget in which the DEA has actually met, and they post their budget summaries every year, and as of this year and for the last 5 years, they've actually met their actual budget, so none of it's actually going into debt. So there's really no evidence that the DEA is, there's no significant, so there's really no evidence there saying that it's as expensive. They have a budget of $3 billion, and saying that if it were to be legalized or whatnot, it'd be causing taxpayers probably 1.6 trillion to be without the actual DEA. So actually having the drug enforcement is actually a deal when it comes down to it. Going off to a secondary claim that it's ineffective, it states that there was an increase in drugs since 1992 by 3.1%, which I feel is greater, even more reason why we actually need the DEA to help regulate drugs. He claims that there was 12,000 to 22,000 people that use drugs nationwide, but showing on my research from the DEA.org actually that there's 20.4 million people in the United States that actually use drugs today. And he used the example of prohibition and how they restricted that and how it wasn't effective, but we still have a restriction of the age of 21 to actually be able to consume alcohol, and it's under the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is part of the Department of Justice, which overlooks the DEA and any of that. So it all has, it all is part of being admission through something. And then he last states that also that the financially it empowers crime and violence throughout society. But an article statistically shows that because the DEA cracks down on the trafficking that's happening through the streets, it raises the prices on drugs because it's harder to get them in, and therefore it makes it less available to those who actually consume. So therefore, it helps prevent the amount of drugs on the street. So in conclusion, I hope that you see why drug enforcement is not a strain on our, as it's not as expensive and ineffective as the claim that was stated.
All right, well, the opening is complicated because I guess the advocate's claim was complicated, so there's a whole bunch of component parts to it. You did cite the secondary claims pretty clearly, and so that makes it a little bit easier to follow. Before we get to the secondary claims, you get on this point about whether or not there is, in fact, a $60 trillion budget. I'm not sure how important it is that there's $60 trillion or $17 trillion. What's the impact of this argument? I guess the impact of the argument ultimately is that the advocate is playing loose with the numbers, that they are using data that might not be completely accurate, that often exaggerates something, and that you think that that's a consistent thing that they're doing. Maybe that's the way it ought to be presented, because the truth of the matter is most of us can't conceptualize $1 trillion, $1 billion, much less $1 trillion. And when you start getting, whether it's $17 trillion or $60 trillion, we're now talking, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin stuff. I don't know, and I'm not even sure anybody cares, and does it really matter here? So the reason that you're making the argument, though, is really talking about the advocate's credibility. That they're not careful with the numbers that they present, and as a result, there's confusion, and you might not want to trust their conclusions. I'll do the best I can to make sure I give you accurate numbers. That's the way I think you want to present that. On the first point, you basically say that it's vague, and I can kind of understand what you're saying, but I think you kind of go off on this tangent as well. The DEA meets its budget. It gets this amount. It spends this amount. They're pretty responsible with it. I don't think that's the point that the advocate is dealing with here. They're basically arguing that whatever money we spend is a waste of money and that would be better used someplace else. It's not that the DEA gets money and they don't account for it. I'm not sure how that argument helps you much. Now, you did have a presentation here. You alluded to a piece of information that said that if we weren't spending this money on the DEA, we'd have $1.6 trillion of costs or harms that would occur. That sounds like a pretty good piece of information, but I don't get a source citation on it. I don't know what it's based on. It sounds very conclusionary here. And if this is a piece of information that you can cite, that would give it a heck of a lot more credibility, and it would be something to counterweight the advocate's argument on that point. On the issue of increased drug use, I think you have an interesting point here. Look, the fact that drug use is going up suggests that we need more more interdiction efforts, not less interdiction efforts, and that the drug use is going up for a variety of reasons. For instance, it might be encouraged by the very kind of speeches that this person is giving. It makes it seem that people should feel free to indulge in these kinds of things. What you need to do is tell us what the negative costs of drug use are. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, whether it's health, death, productivity, accidents. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes along with it. It's not just the number of people that die or how much money you spend. It's the security that you have in your home. It's the relationships that people have. There's I don't know, they're casual drug users. There are plenty of them, and it probably doesn't hurt them that much. So if people smoke pot once in a while, most people don't give a damn about that. It doesn't destroy their life. That's not really what the DEA is worried about. They're worried about the people who are selling cocaine, shooting heroin, importing massive amounts of marijuana. They worry about that, and that's a little bit different, and I think that you need to emphasize that point. And then the idea about the DEA having some influence over the trafficking, I think that that's a good theory. Look, they increase the prices, that makes it less likely that people are going to use. It could be, for instance, that the consequence of getting rid of these restrictions would be massive increases in the use of drugs, which would lead to the problems that we were talking about before. I think that's maybe the good counterclaim to be making on that point. All right, thank you.